John D. Rockefeller's rise to dominance in the American oil industry presents a paradox that continues to trouble rational analysis. How does one man create a monopoly in a commodity industry without inventing a new product, without discovering new oil, without possessing supernatural financial resources at the outset? Oil was oil, kerosene was kerosene. In theory, no single producer should have been able to dominate such a market. Yet Rockefeller didn't merely outperform competitors, he absorbed, neutralized, or eliminated them. Understanding this outcome requires abandoning the assumption that markets are decided by products alone. Instead, examining the deeper structure of organization, incentives, coordination, and time horizons that govern the industry. At the core of the puzzle lies a false symmetry. From a modern retrospective standpoint, it seems obvious that Rockefeller's competitors could have copied his methods, monetized byproducts, standardized production, pooled resources, formed cartels, integrated vertically. None of these actions were secret, illegal, or technologically inaccessible. However, rational possibility doesn't imply practical feasibility. What separated Rockefeller from his rival was not superior intelligence in isolation, but the ability to impose discipline, financial, organizational, and psychological, on an industry defined by chaos. In the early oil industry was fragmented, volatile, and speculative. Hundreds of refineries operated as small partnerships or family-owned businesses, surviving on thin margins and exposed to violent price swings. Their prime objective was short-term survival, not long-term dominance. Rockefeller, by contrast, approached oil not as a gamble but as a system to be stabilized, controlled, and eventually owned. The difference is temporal orientational was decisive. Competitors thought in weeks and months, Rockefeller thought in decades. That alone altered every strategic decision he made. Efficiency inside the refinery was the first stage of his advantage, but not in the simplistic sense of working harder or being smarter. Rockefeller transformed refining from a craft to an industrial process. He standardized operations, measured cost obsessively, reduced waste incrementally, and treated every byproduct as a potential revenue stream. While other refineries focused narrowly on kerosene, he treated crude oil as a bundle of latent products. This was not a matter of hidden knowledge. Chemists already understood that oil could yield lubricants, paraffin, petroleum jelly, and fuel residues. What others lacked was the scale, patience, and capital discipline required to make byproduct monetization economically viable. Byproduct recovery on- Byproduct recovery only becomes profitable at sufficient volume. For a small refinery, building additional facilities to process tar or lubricants looked like an unnecessary expense with uncertain returns. Rockefeller, by aggregating production through acquisition and partnerships, crossed the threshold at which waste became an asset. Once that threshold was crossed, the advantage became self-reinforcing. Standard Oil could sell kerosene cheaper because profits increasingly came from everything else. Rivals attempting to imitate him faced a trap. They needed capital to diversify, but their margins were already collapsing under price pressure. Financial structure magnified this advantage. Rockefeller reinvested relentlessly, while competitors extracted profits to stabilize their personal finance. He treated profits as ammunition. This created a widening gap over time. Moreover, his reputation for reliability made banks willing to extend credit on favorable terms. Access to credit functioned as invisible capital. Even when Rockefeller didn't have cash, he had time, patience, and borrowing capacity. His competitors, operating on fragile balance sheets, could not endure prolonged price wars or experimental investments. Transportation control was the external counterpart to internal efficiency. Rockefeller didn't initiate own railroads, but through volume guarantees and secret rebate agreements, he achieved effective control over the industry's arteries. This didn't merely lower his cost. It structurally raised the price and the cost for others. Transportation thus became a weapon. Competitors often didn't even know why they were losing ground, as rebate systems and drawback schemes were deliberately concealed. Without full information, rational counter strategy was impossible. The idea that competitors could have formed a cartel, sold out, pooled capital, and rebuilt a rival system appears sound in theory. In practice, it collided with the oldest problem in economics collective action. A cartel requires absolute discipline. Every member must sacrifice short term gain for long term strategy. In the oil industry of the 19th century, this was unrealistic. Owners faced immediate debts, volatile prices, and personal risks. Any one member could defect, secretly undercut prices, or sell out to Rockefeller for guaranteed wealth. This incentive to betray the group always exceeded the incentive to endure uncertainty. Moreover, forming a cartel doesn't automatically create organizational competence. Pooling capital does not instantly produce chemists, managers, accountants, logistic partners, or negotiators capable of running an integrated system. Rockefeller had spent years building a managerial apparatus that functioned like a centralized command structure. Most refineries lack not only the personnel but also the mindset required to subordinate individual autonomy to centralized discipline. They were entrepreneurs, not bureaucrats, and many resisted precisely the kind of control Rockefeller imposed. Timing also played a crucial role. Rockefeller's consolidation was not a single event but a sequence of moves executed rapidly and asymmetrically. By the time competitors perceived the full scope of his strategy, the window for effective resistance had closed. Any attempt to organize against him occurred under conditions he already influenced. Transportation pricing, market access, credit availability, and regional pricing wars. In strategic terms, he faced his rivals to react while retaining the initiative himself. The rational decision for many competitors, therefore, was not to fight, but to sell. Selling to Standard Oil often meant receiving stock in a growing empire rather than facing near certain bankruptcy. From an individual perspective, this was not cowardice but optimization under constraint. Fighting Rockefeller required long term sacrifice with uncertain payoff. Selling offered immediate security. Rational actors acting individually produced an irrational collective outcome monopoly. The deeper lesson is that monopolies in commodity markets are not created by controlling the product, but by controlling the system surrounding the product. Rockefeller didn't invent oil, nor did he monopolize geology. He monopolized logistics, finance, organization, and time. His competitors were not stupid, they were trapped in a structure that rewarded short term rationality and punished long term coordination. He escaped that structure by imposing a different one. In retrospect, it is tempting to image counterfactuals in which rivalry unite early, build alternative infrastructure, and challenge his dominance. Such scenarios are logically coherent but historically improbable. They require levels of trust, discipline, foresight that rarely emerge spontaneously among competitors under financial stress. Rockefeller succeeded not because others couldn't imagine his strategies, but because he alone was willing and able to execute them consistently, patiently, and without deviation. Thus, the monopoly didn't arise from magic, inventions, or moral failure on the part of others. It rose from asymmetry in organization and resolve. Rockefeller didn't defeat his competitors by outthinking them in isolated moments. He defeated them by building a system that made resistance economical and psychologically irrational. In a commodity market, that is the only way a monopoly can exist, and it remains the central lesson of his rise.